Elisabeth, could you please tell us a little bit about your background or your perspectives?
Yes, I'm trained as an evolution biologist, and I've looked pretty deeply into the 4 billion years of our living Earth and how it evolved, also from a spiritual perspective that brings me to conferences like this. Because while I was taught in Western science, which makes certain assumptions about the universe being non-living, meaningless, purposeless, running down by entropy, and life a Darwinian competitive struggle against this tide of entropy washing everything away, which life eventually loses, which I came to see as the most depressing creation story that any human culture has ever told. And science, of course, gets to tell the creation story in secular societies. So I looked again at how can this evolution work if we do assume that this is a living universe in which the process of the universe is the self-creation of living systems in all their complexity, from galaxies down to Earths, living planets that then evolve living ecosystems and societies eventually of beings like ourselves. And in that story, I found a maturation cycle that repeats itself over and over, beginning with the first bacteria of Earth. And bacteria had all evolution to themselves for half of those 4 billion years. For 2 billion years, only bacteria evolved on the Earth, packaging themselves out of the Earth's crust, inventing all kinds of lifestyles, being feisty and competitive and rather Darwinian for a very long time. They are the only creatures of Earth other than ourselves who created global problems. They created global hunger by eating up all the free food, the sugars and acids that had formed naturally on the surface of the Earth. And when they had eaten those all up, they had to get inventive and harness solar energy to make food. And then again, making food from solar energy is a process of photosynthesis, and the waste gas from that is oxygen. They were so successful in doing this that the oxygen piled up, absorbed by the seas and earth, and then eventually piling up in the atmosphere, until that caused global toxicity, global pollution. And then again, they solved that problem by inventing a lifestyle in which you use oxygen to make a living. So it's fascinating to me that in addition to solving global problems that were their own creation, they also invented such technologies as photosynthesis and as nuclear piles to keep themselves warm. They concentrated uranium, and they invented the first electric motors, which are made of 40 different proteins in rotor stators, ball bearings, camshafts, all the parts of motors. And they invented the first World Wide Web by trading DNA freely with each other to develop different kinds of bacteria and different kinds of lifestyles. So what happens after that long period of this very creative and feisty competition and problem solving is that they come to the understanding that it is cheaper to feed your enemies than to kill them. And this is where all species afterwards had to learn this if they wanted to survive, that you have an expansion economy to a certain point. Your body did it, it grew to a certain point, and then it has to level off into a period of sustainability. That's what we humans are learning right now. When the bacteria learned that, they formed huge cooperatives of different kinds of bacteria working together, each giving some of their DNA to a central library we call the nucleus of the cell. And this cell, which has never had to be reinvented since, is the cells that we are made of. So the nucleated cells, the fruit of cooperation after a long period of competition, become the new entities on the planet. And then they go through another billion years of their own youthful expansion and creativity and diversity before they get the same thing. It's cheaper to feed your enemies than to kill them. And so they develop multi-celled creatures as cooperatives. And of course, we are multi-celled creatures. Now, the rest of evolution you learned in school, where, it starts in the sea and you come out onto land and we get flowering plants and mammals and all of those things, so I don't have to repeat that part of the story. So we can skip now to where humans come into the scene. And humans, for about 100,000 years that we've been around, learned cooperation at the tribal level after a lot of competition and started to build big urban centers, which were the equivalent of the nucleated cell in our social terms. Then those big urban center cooperatives were new on the planet and went about 4,000 to 6,000 years when they began forming, went into again the youthful mode of competition. And that's where we are now, is we're reaching the adolescent, the end of the adolescent phase, and our globalization process is showing that we have grown our economy to the limits of our planet, and we have to become sustainable now. So we have to realize that it's cheaper to feed our enemies than to kill them, and stop making war on each other, and build our sustainability. Fortunately, we have our bodies as role models. Our bodies are cooperatives of these giant bacterial cooperatives, so cooperatives of cooperatives, to the tune of 100 trillion cells, each of which is as complex as a large human city, working in concert with each other and through communion rather than communication, knowing themselves as part of a cooperative. And no organ in our bodies is exploiting the others or trying to get it to be like itself. I like to say, what if our world economy were done in our bodies? We would call the heart-lung system the northern industrial organs. And of course, they have to get raw material blood cells from bone marrow all over the body. So they mine it, and it comes up to the heart-lung system where the blood is purified and oxygen is added, and it makes a rich blood. Now, if we were using our global economics model, then the heart would say, as a distribution center, the body price for blood is so much today, who wants, and then you sell it to the rest of the body, and some of the organs, maybe some of the bones even, that contributed the raw materials would not be able to afford it. And so it's very clear that we can't live in a capitalist economy in our own bodies. What do we do with that when we know that this was good for expanding the economy, and we all grew to a certain size before we leveled off? Now we have to shift into a different kind of economy. And the best models I know in the world are neither communist nor capitalist, but they are living economies that mimic nature much more closely than anything we have done so far in our larger societies. And I could talk about a few of those role models if you like.
Now or later, how much of this is just remembering who we are, and how much is inventing something completely new that we sort of have to invent ourselves?
The role of evolution biology, I think, is to show us the long trajectory of the past in which nature learned again and again what it means to move from expansive creative societies into sustainably creative societies. And so there's a point in helping humans remember the biological past. We also have to recognize that, in my view of things, that we are spirit having a human experience, and that we are here to ground cosmic love in our societies. And I think possibly the reason why democracy has not worked as well as we had hoped it would work is because we cut ourselves off from our spiritual interconnections. And I mean, even biologically, we breathe each other's cells all the time, and we breathe in bits of DNA from other species, and our body knows which ones it might want to keep and which ones it rejects. And our guts are full of bacteria that are not within our cells as descendants of the ancient bacteria, but occupy our guts to the tune of about 1 quadrillion of them. And the newest information is that they run 85% of our immune systems. So we'd better watch what we eat, what we feed them, because they are the ones keeping us healthy. And we have to stop seeing bacteria just as disease germs, because it's a tiny percentage of them that are causing problems, and the huge majority of them are we couldn't live without. They digest our food and run our immune system, do all kinds of wonderful things for us. So if you recognize all nature as intelligent, as spirit materialized, then you start to see that our job here is, as I say, to ground cosmic love, which means that we will care and share for each other, which means in biological terms that we discover that it takes less energy to make friends than to maintain enmity. Now, because we're at the end of the empire building phase for humanity, which is an adolescence, we can see that there was a point in going through adolescence. You will never get mature cooperative citizens if they don't go through adolescence first. And you don't step on caterpillars if you want butterflies. You know, these transformations are natural. And if we combine evolution, the stories of evolution, with our understanding of ourselves as cosmic spiritual beings, and we see that the maturation process always has to occur again and again, then we can begin to see how we do it. And we are doing it now, because we have more than 1 million NGOs, for instance, in the world, most of which are feeding people locally, or cleaning rivers, or connecting people with each other, building eco-villages. All of these things are cooperative ventures. And even at the larger size scale, we have the United Nations as a cooperative venture. We have international space stations. We have world parliaments of religions. I'm crusading for a world consortium of sciences that can talk to each other across very different beliefs about what kind of a universe we're in.
And then you have mentioned, excuse me, one very specific thing that we need to be more aware of, and that is how we create the money in our society.
Yes. One of the most interesting things about our own physiology is that every one of our cells has about 1,000 bankers in it. I said each cell is as complex as a large human city, and there are 100 trillion working in concert with each other. And each of those cells has about 30,000 recycling centers that are renewing our proteins. And they are as sophisticated as a chipper machine that you stick a dead tree in, and instead of chips at the other end, you get a new live tree. So they're amazing technologies in your own cells. So 30,000 recycling centers and about 1,000 banks. They're called mitochondria, and they issue a currency called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. And they are the equivalent of stored value debit cards. So you go to the bank, you get a debit card, it's loaded with a certain line that you can spend into the economy. And that's what happens in the cell. The ATP is used to catalyze all the transactions in the cellular economy. And when the card is spent, it is taken back to the bank and it's reloaded with no debt. You never pay back what you spent, no interest was charged, and you get more money to spend. The bank's job is to regulate the amount of currency in circulation to prevent inflation or deflation. Now, this system has operated for billions of years with never inflation or deflation. And we could copy this easily in our own system. We could be doing this. There's a very excellent movie online called The Secret of Oz on the financial system. And in it you will hear, it doesn't matter what backs a currency, it matters how it's regulated by those who issue it. Now, the mistake we've made in the world, and it was called a mistake thousands of years ago by Christianity, by Judaism, and by Islam, all knew that debt money will wreck economies. And now we're seeing that, how destructive debt money is. So we still haven't listened to the great religious leaders to stop doing this kind. Instead, we're enthralled to the bankers who now tell us, you do recession now. Unemployment, you owe us the money, you have to pay back your debts.
Because the money comes from these private banks and not from the central banks, which most of the people think.
Well, in the United States, the the Federal Reserve is actually a private banking system. In Europe, you have government banks, but in the Federal Reserve, which is perhaps the most important bank in the world, is a debt money private bank, right? Why should the government, which had the constitutional right to coin money, be borrowing money from private banks? The Congress in the United States voted away their right to coin money and gave it to private banks in 1911 or 1913, I think it was, and founded the Federal Reserve using the word federal, even though it's not a government agency, and not using the word bank to throw people off. So anyway, we have a money system that is like a monopoly game designed to concentrate wealth in few hands. It's working exactly the way it was designed to work. And it's our job now to reinvent that wheel and to do better kinds of currencies that work better for us. And you can have a new book called Money and Sustainability by Bernard Lietaer and other authors just has been published, and it talks about ecologies of currency, using different currencies for different purposes, local currencies, national currencies, international currencies. The best thing is to evolve our way out of debt money by creating more and more levels of non-debt money. So we can do this in the United States. It's legal. You don't call it dollars or euros or make it look that way. It doesn't matter how you make it look. You can call it In Community We Trust and call it ours or whatever you want to call it.
And in the US, you also have publicbankinginstitute.org. Which is promoting the idea of having a state-owned bank, which there is one in North Dakota.
Yes.
And now there's some 14 states that are getting their own
State
banks.
banks.
State
Yes,
banks.
state
California
banks.
being the next one. And in the UK, you have positivemoney.org, which is also explaining how we can make a peaceful shift
Yes.
into another
Yes, and
currency.
the Kennedys in Germany, Declan and Margaret Kennedy, have systems for express money, and there's a lot of information on the internet about alternative currency systems for sure. So we can do all of these things, and we must do all of these things. We must recognize now that governments will not take care of people. And I have it on advice from someone who was very prominent in Shell Oil, who says there is no corporation in the world that can stop any of the crises coming, not global warming, not financial collapse, not the aging populations of the world. All of these things we have to face, and we have to live with them. And we can. Humans have been through 10 ice ages. We managed that. I would think we can get through one hot age. And we can get creative. I went to Morocco a few years ago just to study how people lived well in deserts thousands of years ago with very low technologies, easy ones to create, and they have many ways of making themselves comfortable and feeding themselves and having enough water in deserts. So we can do these things, but we must look them square in the face and not pretend they're not happening, and be resourceful. And I think in the process we will learn real democracy, although we may not call it that. We may call it living systems, copying mature ecosystems that have worked out peaceful interchange. And I love the fact that no matter what your political persuasion is, you have the same kind of cooperative body. And one of my role models is Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. A Catholic priest decided he didn't want an economy based on capitalism or communism, but on loving human relationships. So he went around in the bars, places where young people hung out, and asked them, how would you build an economy based on loving human relationships? And then they worked it out, they designed it, and they made it a commercial cooperative where the people own the business that they work in, and they decided no salary should be higher, more than 10 times higher than the lowest one, and that the people at the bottom levels of the company would rotate into management, and people would share the experiences of the different levels of management and things like this, and they take care of each other. In a recession, if they have to fire 10% of the people, they still give them most of their salary, and they can retrain them if they want retraining. and then do it by lottery. And then the following year they can come back to work. If they still need to do this, they, by lottery, will let the others off for 1 year without dropping them from the community. And another wonderful model is the Sarvodaya movement of Sri Lanka, which was founded by Dr. A.T. Ariyaratne and has been going for 50 years now. He's a good friend of Eunice's. They somehow worked out microfinance with each other. And they now have 15,000 villages in development. And the way they start with a new village is to teach the people to meditate on inner peace and on generosity toward each other. So it builds community immediately. As soon as someone develops, they share their gifts.
So
And
the shift comes from within. It's not about changing what's out there.
No. The attitude comes from within. The resources are out there, and many things can be done without money to start creating, to grow gardens, to raise. After the Soviet Union collapsed, I just wanted to tear my hair out hearing that Tyson's frozen chickens were being shipped to Russia. If the Russians can't grow chickens, I don't know, chickens get their own food out in any kind of greenery where there are grass and bugs. You don't have to feed them, they feed you. Nature's bountiful. The grasslands in the world today are a huge desertification problem and are burning. We have to put cows back onto them, because only with cows can grasslands restore themselves every year, because they always have a long dry period where the soil bacteria can't survive if they don't have cow guts to go through, buffaloes or whatever is the natural horses, hoofed animals of the steppes, of the grasslands. And they can be restored within about 10 years if you put free-ranging cows or buffalo on them. And again, it's free meat because they reproduce. And cows' methane production is only a problem when you stuff them into feedlots, not when they're running wild over large areas. No, the fires are much more dangerous than what the cows are producing in the way of gas. And but you have to spread it out and not get concentrations of it. So anyway, the solutions are all there if we mimic nature, and we now use the word biomimicry, which includes not just copying nature, but respectfully copying it and seeing how it recycles, how it puts no toxins into its technologies and creates the most sophisticated materials on Earth without heat, beat, treating, and wasting 96% of the resources just to make something like a computer, and then 2 years later throws it in a landfill, which ends up being 100% waste.
So it's back to reality, back to nature, back to spirit.
Yes,
in
it's
the
all
process
about
of
integrating, as I like to see us as a keyboard of vibrations from the low keys of matter through the mid-range of energy into consciousness and spirit, and that we can play the whole keyboard, not as bodies with souls or souls with bodies, but as spirit, matter, soul bodies, It's
Sweden here and Romania here. Yes. So two cells in the same organism, which is the world and humanity. Romania is in a transition, and certainly adolescent competition between people, because we have only 20 years of democracy after the fall of communism.
Yes.
On the other side, you have this developed cell of humanity. The body and the image you gave is for me wonderful. But there in the body, you have already a fine-tuned cooperation. So everything is already going smoothly.
Yes.
How do you see, for instance, an adolescent society full of competition, another society that is, let's say, poor in one of the poor countries? So the cells are actually not yet fine-tuned, and they are very different.
They're in the adolescent phase, and when we recognize that, we said adolescence is about individualism and competition, right, and expansion and creatively expanding. And East Europe, of course, suffered a great deal from the Thatcher-Reagan privatization of the world kind of economics, where the word restructuring just sends my hair on end too, because it means privatizing countries that were communist countries. And you see, communism sacrificed the motivation of the individual by focusing on what you can give to the larger collective, right? And capitalism sacrifices community to individual gain, to greed, to personal greed. So we have these strange things that come and go in waves in our society, where China, for instance, was very focused on trying to build socialism, communism, just when the capitalist West came in and taught it to do, the feeding frenzy of competition. I spoke to one lady who trains MBA students in China, and she said in 8 years, the country was shifted from young people serving their society to young people wanting to climb the corporate ladder at elbowing everybody else out of the way to do it. So we moved from what maybe potentially could have been a mature mode, but we weren't ready for it. So communism collapsed first by denying individual interest. In the body, every cell meets its individual interest, and every organ does as well. And so you have constant negotiations between the individual and the community for the well-being of the whole.
But
and
until you reach that stage,
Yes.
what do you do as, let's say,
Yes.
individual? Because
Right.
in Romania, it's lots of
Yes.
competition, young people,
Yes.
the other ones. How
Tell
could you
them
help?
tell them the story of evolution, in which again and again species go through this necessary juvenile competitive phase in order to reach maturity. Don't we expect every one of those young people in Romania to end up as cooperative community citizens by the time they're 40?
Well, younger people
Yeah.
are more cooperative, and there is lots of entrepreneurship and really serving. The
That's a
issue
very
which
good
we
sign.
see is with the generation over 40. So
I
part
would-
of the older
yeah.
cells
Yeah.
with some new intermediate cells, and the young ones are trying very hard.
Focus on the young ones, because they are here to
Okay.
bring the new mature stage. And I like to say to children, you have to help the grown-ups grow up now. I mean, we all over the world teach our children, don't hit each other, don't take things from each other, don't call each other names, right? And then they
Yes.
turn on the television set, what are the grown-ups doing? Calling each other names, taking things away from each other, hitting each other, right? So the children know that we're hypocrites, that what we teach them isn't what the grown-ups are actually doing. So I like to say to audiences, what shall we do? Stop teaching children these things, or start practicing these things ourselves? So now I think the children have to help the grown-ups grow up, because they see the hypocrisy,